So we'll get started. So thank you all for attending the lecture after lunch. Unfortunately, you're stuck with me again, but here we are. So hopefully you all had a good lunch and had some stimulating discussions. Hopefully we can all agree on that, right? It's my great pleasure to be presenting on the Austrian theory of the business cycle. So this is a talk that really builds on top of some of the stuff that we've discussed yesterday and today, the banking lecture that I gave yesterday, and then the interest lecture given by Dr. Herbner, as well as the capital theory lecture that was just given by Dr. Rittenauer. So what's this presentation about, right? I think you can make an argument that Austrian business cycle theory is the defining feature of Austrian economics. You can talk about entrepreneurship, you can talk about socialist calculation, but I think you can make a very good argument that Austrian business cycle theory is sort of the defining feature because it really combines a lot of other aspects of Austrian economics on entrepreneurship, on monetary theory, on capital theory, the dynamics of interventionism, so on and so forth. So what I want to do is I want to first discuss the Austrian theory of sustainable growth. This is something that Dr. Rittenauer had been building up towards. I want to look at it from a structure of production framework. So what happens when time preferences decrease, time preferences are lower, time preferences fall, however we want to describe this. I'll explain why we're going through this before we get to the Austrian theory of unsustainable growth. And this, of course, is the boom and bust business cycle. So the key words so far are sustainable and unsustainable. So I don't mean sustainable in some sort of green energy way. I'm referring to it in the sense that when the structure of production changes, will it be maintained, or is there going to be sort of a self-reversing feature, right? And as we'll see, that's going to happen under the business cycle. So a couple of questions that I want to answer throughout this talk are, question one, what causes the boom, right? What brings about the boom? Question two, why does the boom continue? Why do business cycles, or why does the boom phase of a business cycle continue for several years, sometimes close to a decade, and so on? And the final question is, what causes the bust? These questions are actually somewhat unique to Austrian economics, at least questions 1 and 2, because most mainstream economics, they'll talk about 3. For them, there really is no theory of an unsustainable boom. It's just you've got growth, and then something happens, something gets screwed up, and then you've got a bust, right? So what causes the bust, that's something that a lot of mainstream economists, they have various theories. There's a shortfall of aggregate demand, something like that. But the boom, they don't really focus on the boom. Everything's just great during the boom. So hopefully you had some time to read the required text for this lecture. This is Murray Rothbard's Economic Depressions, Their Cause and Cure. It's a small pamphlet. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend that you do. I'll be building on it as well as obviously going in more depth on certain topics of interest, right? So in this pamphlet, Rothbard really kind of answered these questions, I think, and he did it in such a clear and lucid way. All right, so what are we trying to explain? When we talk about a business cycle, I'm referring to the modern business cycle that really started to become, when I talk about modern, of course, as an Austrian, I could say modern is like mid-1700s, right? That's modern. But it still applies whether we're looking at the 1800s, the 1900s, or the 21st century. The modern business cycle has 3 main characteristics that we are trying to explain. Any good theory of the business cycle needs to be able to explain these features. The first feature is that the boom experiences monetary-induced changes in overall prices. In other words, the money supply is going up during the boom. This is leading to an increase in the demand for goods and services, a rise in prices, spending is going up. Okay, we need to have some sort of explanation of this, right? The boom, any good theory of the boom has to talk about money. There's got to be some sort of monetary element here. The second characteristic is that the boom and the bust show large swings in the capital goods industry. So I don't think I mentioned this before. Just want to emphasize, when I'm talking about the bust, I'm referring to, say, a recession, or what used to be called a depression. But so the boom and the depression, they show large swings or fluctuations in the capital goods industry. So Dr. Herbner spoke about higher orders and lower orders. I'm using the same terminology here. The higher order goods or the higher order stages of production, those are the capital goods industries. They're the industries that make the capital goods, that then make other capital goods, that then make other capital goods, that eventually make consumer goods. Various types of mining, refining, manufacturing, making, say, the machines that then make Tesla cars. Right? Those are higher order goods. Those are very capital intensive industries. And they show large fluctuations. They grow a lot in the boom and then they contract a lot in the bust, especially relative to, say, the consumer goods industries, the lower order industries. So these, if higher orders refer to production processes that are temporally remote from consumption. The lower orders refer to production processes that are temporally closer to consumption, short production processes, and so on, thinking of retail, wholesale, distribution, and so on. Those industries fluctuate. They grow during the boom, they contract during the bust, but not as much as the capital goods industries, right? And then the third characteristic we're trying to explain is why is the crisis marked by a cluster of entrepreneurial errors? Right, entrepreneurs, as we've learned so far, they're trained on the market. You have good entrepreneurs, you have bad entrepreneurs. Good entrepreneurs earn profits, bad entrepreneurs earn losses. The selection mechanism weeds out the bad entrepreneurs and so on. So there's a little bit of a test to kind of keep entrepreneurs on their toes, so to speak. But the crisis, the beginning of the bust, is sort of this widespread revelation of error. So we think of during the housing bubble and bust, a bunch of entrepreneurs invested in houses and then they realized that, wait a second, this was a mistake, right? Why do you have so many entrepreneurs making mistakes at the same time? We wouldn't expect this on the free market. So the business cycle theory has to explain this, okay? All right, how are we going to explain these features? As I discussed briefly before, we're first going to look at sustainable growth, right? Time preference induced growth. Now, why? Because one of the unique characteristics of the Austrian approach is that we must first explain how an economy can possibly work right before we can understand how it could go wrong. As Austrians, this applies to not just the business cycle, but just government intervention. We don't first look at government intervention. We first look at how the free market can produce order out of chaos, how it can lead to an efficient allocation of resources, and then we look at how government intervention basically distorts that. It screws it up. All right, we want to do the same thing with the business cycle. And when it comes to the business cycle, this is a point made by Hayek, F.A. Hayek, who was he was a very influential Austrian economist who developed did a lot of contributions to Austrian business cycle theory, and Roger Garrison, who for many years had given this talk at Mises University and also wrote a great book on the subject, Time and Money, would also make this point. So I want to make this point. We first have to look at how things can go right before we're able to really comprehend how they can go wrong. And this will help us understand the entrepreneurial cluster of errors too, because we'll see how the entrepreneurial cluster of errors does not occur without outside of the business cycle. All right, so what causes economic growth? All right. We could go through a more specific definition of economic growth, but all I'm referring to with economic growth is an increase in production and higher living standards. So the economy advances, civilization becomes more advanced, more goods are produced, better types of consumer goods, more consumer goods, so on and so forth. All right. So there's a couple of things that could cause economic growth. You could have an increase in the labor supply, right? More people just making stuff, and that's going to lead to greater production. That could come from an increase in the labor force, either from higher birth rates or from immigration and so on. That's going to lead to more goods being produced. You could have technological innovation, right? New ways of figuring out how to make stuff, new recipes, so to speak, assembly line, automation, artificial intelligence, all that stuff. These are all technological innovations. Another important ingredient in economic growth is the quality of free market institutions. So if a country moves away from socialism to capitalism, such as, say, China and India, and even Russia, really formerly the USSR did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, those three countries all at different times, you would see an increase in economic growth because you're channeling more and more resources through the market system, okay? So all of these can cause economic growth, but what I want to talk about is an increase in savings. Right? This is sort of the Austrian story. So when I'm referring to an increase in savings, I'm referring to a restriction in consumption and then channeling that through investment, right? So as we'll talk about, basically through purchasing factors of production or purchasing titles to said factors of production. Right? Higher and higher savings, according to the Austrians, leads to greater economic growth and economic progress. Okay. So this brings us to capital-based macroeconomics. Most macroeconomics that you learn in an undergraduate economics course, they focus on labor and monetary aggregates. Right? So it focuses on, say, the unemployment rate, the health of the labor market. You might talk about the money supply a bit, or at least nominal spending, especially aggregate demand, aggregate supply, right? These types of statistics, those are important to mainstream economics. Austrian economics is different. Austrian economics has been called capital-based macroeconomics, and I think that's a great way of describing it, because Austrians, we focus on capital goods. Right? We just had a whole lecture on capital theory and the structure of production and so on. Capital-based macroeconomics analyzes the relationship between time preferences, right? We're going to define all these terms in a second, the interest rate, and the structure of production. See how they're all linked together, and how when one of these changes, it's going to lead to changes in the other. Right? So this is a very different approach than, say, a standard neoclassical macroeconomics course. So what do I mean by all these terms? Well, we've already learned some of these earlier in the day, but again, reinforcement is always essential. So by time preferences, I'm referring to the premium on present consumption over future consumption. Right? In particular, at least in the macroeconomy, it's the proportion of money people devote to consumption relative to the proportion of money they devote to savings and investment spending. All right, we can talk about this a bit more, but I'm kind of defining savings and investment as equivalent. You know, they're the same thing, or at least they're two different ways of saying the same thing, or two different sides of the same coin. When you save, you restrict consumption, and then you have to relinquish your ability to spend that money, and you then spend that money on investment goods, right? And really, the proportion of consumption to investment spending is the degree to which you spend your money on satisfying present desires versus satisfying future desires, because you invest so you can consume in the future. All right, the originary interest rate, Dr. Herbner, in his talk, he used the term pure interest rate. That comes from Rothbard. I'm using the term originary interest rate. It comes from Mises. So you can just think of pure interest rate or originary interest rate. In this context, they basically mean the exact same thing. The originary interest rate, how time preferences are manifested in the economy, is we can kind of think about it as the average sort of underlying rate of return in an industry, right? Really, interest is not determined in the loan market. All right, that's how a lot of people think of interest. There's a loan rate of interest. You want to borrow money to buy a car. You want to borrow money to invest in a business and so on. That's a loan interest rate. But what the interest rate that's determined on the loanable funds market, that's actually determined by this average rate of return in industry. Okay? What really matters, the fundamental interest rate, according to Austrian economists, is the interest rate that capitalist entrepreneurs earn by investing in a production process. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. And then you have, last but certainly not least, the structure of production. and by the structure of production, I'm referring to the temporal process of moving capital goods from higher order stages, right? Those long-term production processes far away from consumption, mining, manufacturing, and so on, through the lower order stages, wholesale, retail, and so on, until they turn into consumer goods, right? Every good that you buy at the store or buy on Amazon, there's a whole structure of production behind it, right? So we want to see how all of these are related, right? How they all sort of work together, what the relationship is, okay? So you might be panicking now. You're going to say, oh my goodness, is there going to be this much text on all of the slides? Or this is a lot of information. Can this be expressed graphically? I thought you never asked, right? So yes, it can be expressed graphically. It can be expressed graphically, as we'll see, through a trapezoid. So we have the stages of production. We have higher orders on the right side, lower orders on the left side, and then we've got consumption spending. So in the higher order stages, capitalists will spend a certain amount of money, say growing wheat, right? Then they're going to sell it to the next stage, say a mill, a flour mill that's going to thresh the wheat and turn it into flour. They're going to earn a rate of return measured by that black line. So the miller is going to buy the wheat. Then he's going to have to pay money to the land and labor. So his total rectangle kind of goes beyond the black line. And then he's going to thresh the wheat and turn it into flour. And he's going to sell it to a bakery, right? The bakery is going to buy the flour. It's going to hire some workers, it has some land, and so on. They're going to bake the flour, turn it into bread, and then they're going to sell the bread to some sort of food processor, and the food processor is then going to hire some more groceries, some workers, maybe some people at a grocery store, whatever, and then they are going to sell it to the consumers. So each of these rectangular bars represents the amount of money spent at each stage of production. They represent the cumulative prices, if you will. And you kind of draw it, and it's like all these weird rectangles and some weird diagonal lines and stuff. So what we can do is, for simplicity, we can just have a trapezoid, all right? So we've got stages of production. On the horizontal axis is higher orders, right? Lower orders. The goods are moving through the stages, and at each stage, they're earning the originary interest, right? They're earning the originary interest rate. So it's the slope of the trapezoid, if you will. And at the end, they are selling the finished consumer goods, say bread, to the consumers who are spending $100 or whatever. And we can aggregate all of this at each stage of production. Say certain capital goods are made that aren't actually going to turn into consumer goods until 5 years into the future, and so on. So we have this nice structure of production that we can just show with a trapezoid, all right? And this trapezoid is like, wait, I thought it was triangles. Wait, what's going on? But Hayek originally really drew trapezoids. They're strictly speaking, they're trapezoids, and Rothbard continued this, and I say, well, we're going to do that too. We're going to have trapezoids. All right. So let's look at time preference induced growth. All right. What's going to happen? So when people have lower time preferences, people have a lower premium on present consumption. They are more willing to save. So the amount of money that they devote to consumption decreases relative to the amount of money they devote to savings and investment. They are spending less on present consumption and spending more on future consumption. This is what we mean by lower time preferences. And this is really a major reason why civilization has become more advanced over the centuries. We have lower and lower time preferences. We care more and more about the future, all right? So how will this look sort of, how can we show this process graphically, right? So here's how we're going to show it graphically. So we've got our trapezoid. There's a decrease in consumption. It's going to be a decrease in the demand for the lower order goods. If consumers are spending less on consumption, well, that means that the stages closest to consumption, they're going to be making less money. So what happens is the amount of money earned in those stages is going to decline, right? You see the amount of money that the price spread or the rate of return in those stages declines, right? This is part of phase one, as we'll see. So that leads to lower prices in the lower orders. At the same time, though, this isn't the whole story. People are going to save. They're going to decrease their consumption. They're going to lend it. They're going to put it, say, on the loanable funds market. They might directly invest it in a company. We can just say they're going to be put, the funds are going to be sent to the loanable funds market, right? The loan banking that we discussed yesterday. It's going to lead to an increase in the supply of loanable funds and a decrease in the loan rate of interest. And so what that's going to do is the lower loan rate of interest, or lower interest rate, that's going to increase the relative profitability of long-term production processes compared to short-term production processes, just due to the nature of present value discounting. And Dr. Herbner touched on this a little bit earlier in the day. And that's going to lead to an increase in the demand for the higher orders. All right, because now more money is being channeled into the higher stages of production, into building the machines that build the capital goods, that build the consumer goods that you and I buy, right? And that's going to lead to additional stages being created and higher prices in those stages. So the cumulative prices in the lower orders are decreasing, and they are rising in the higher orders. So overall, the interest rate declines. The originary rate of interest declines. Right? The trapezoid has become longer, and it's kind of flattened, if you will. Right? And we got our little arrows here. So this is very important. This is sustainable because time preferences are lower, and eventually that money is going to wind up into the public's income. Right? The capitalists, they're going to earn profit that they can spend how they choose to spend. Workers are going to earn wages. Landowners, they're going to earn incomes as well. And they're going to continue to spend at their lower time preferences. Right? So the next, say, round of spending, phase two, if you will, is going to be along the red line. Right? The structure of production, as the economy is adjusting, people will keep spending according to their lower time preferences, the lower proportion of consumption to investment spending. And that's going to lead to an increase in the supply of capital goods. That will lead to an increase in the supply of consumer goods, and that will lead to lower prices of consumer goods. More consumer goods, better quality consumer goods, and so on. And this is the economic growth. This is higher living standards, right? We all are able to enjoy the benefits of prior generations expanding the structure of production, of adding additional stages, of creating more capital goods, so on and so forth. All right. So with this in mind, we know sustainable growth. There's no entrepreneurial cluster of errors. Yeah, the lower orders are suffering losses, but those resources get allocated to the higher orders, and that's leading to more production in the future and even in the present, really. So there's no, the entrepreneurs, they can estimate this. This is no problem. This has happened before in history. So how do we get the business cycle? Well, we get the business cycle when policymakers think that they can short circuit this process. So now we move away from loan banking to deposit banking, or at least in particular, we move to central banking. So instead of the public saving, well, why don't we just get the central bank to pump in more credit, right? To encourage the fractional reserve banks to expand credit, right? Expansionary monetary policy. We kind of went through this process. Powell and Sons, Yellen and Co., the Bernanke Bank, right? Greenspan guarantee, all of this stuff. And we discussed this whole process, and that was an example of expansionary monetary policy, right? Trying to increase the money supply to lower interest rates and stimulate economic growth. So the Federal Reserve can absolutely do this. The question is, can it permanently lower the interest rate? And can it permanently lengthen the structure of production? Okay, that's the important thing. That's the important question. Does this actually last? And the answer is no, it does not last, okay? It creates an unsustainable boom that leads to a bust, right? And this is the Austrian business cycle theory. So I got my water, structure of production right here, and consumer good. All right. So we now want to look at this in more depth. So we're going to first start off with a one-shot injection of credit. And this comes from Mises and Hayek and Rothbard. And I love the idea of an injection. It's like you're injecting steroids or something. You're doping a horse or whatever. It's an injection. You already know. You already think it's bad or something like that, right? So it's already you're already getting the right information. So we've got a boom. We've got credit expansion. All right. It's going to lead to an increase in supply of loanable funds, and that will lead to a decrease in the loan rate of interest, but the originating rate has not changed. Public's time preferences, they haven't changed. So entrepreneurs, they're going to see this lower loan rate, and they're going to say, oh, certain projects are profitable that were previously not profitable. They're going to take this money, and they're going to invest it. It's going to lead to an increase in the demand for the higher orders, and get that, right? So we get something that looks like this. Now, know what happens. The lower orders have not decreased in profitability at all. So really, it's just kind of an increase all throughout the economy, but especially in the higher orders. New stages are created, the structure of production lengthens, and the relative prices in the higher orders rise as compared to the lower orders, all right? So we see the rise in the prices, and the economy's lengthening. More resources are being devoted to the higher orders. More new stages of production are being created. New types of high-tech machines, artificial intelligence, automation technologies, and so on. The issue is this: from this one-shot injection of credit, well, all this new money is eventually going to filter down into the public's income. And the public's time preferences haven't changed. This is a very important point. Right, we say everything else equal, the time preferences remain the same. They're not rising, they're not falling, they're remaining the same. So the public's going to spend according to their old proportions. They're only going to save enough for the old structure of production, right? Not for the new projects that were created. So what happens is we see the spending basically go back to the structure of production. The difference, the original structure of production, the difference is that it's just at a greater amount of nominal spending. So the blue line, phase two, it's just the old structure of production. It's just at a greater amount of spending, right? This is a problem. There's malinvestment as well as undersaving. So malinvestment are these production processes that we thought were profitable, the entrepreneurs thought were profitable, but they actually turn out not to be profitable, okay? This is that sort of the cluster of errors, if you will, right? And the public's not saving enough. They're not profitable because the public isn't saving enough. They're consuming too much relative to what entrepreneurs thought they were consuming. So resources, they initially get redirected, they get directed to the higher orders. Now they're getting brought back to, say, the lower orders. And we start to see an issue. So if all you had was a one-shot injection of credit, then, I've got my arrow here, so that's phase two. If all you had is a one-shot injection of credit, the boom would turn into a crisis, and then we would have a bust, okay? So the bust is the reallocation process as shown by the green arrow, where basically now the resources have to get reallocated. Certain goods have to be liquidated. They have to be sold at the market prices. Certain types of machines, certain workers have to get discharged, or at least their nominal wages have to be cut. Businesses have to go bankrupt, and so on. So this is the actual sort of, we could say, the concrete transfer of scarce factors of production from the higher order stages back to the lower order stages, back to those stages that the public's time preferences could actually sustain, okay? So it's a multiple step process. We got all these sort of trapezoids, right, moving around, okay? So we can see from this that the Austrian business cycle theory explains the cycle's characteristics. We've seen the monetary explanation, right? There's an increase in the money supply from credit expansion. We see the greater swings in the capital goods industries, or the higher orders compared to the lower orders. They expand more in the boom because interest rates are lower, and that makes long-term production processes more profitable relative to short-term production processes. And we see the cluster of entrepreneurial error is brought about by entrepreneurs being tricked or sort of fooled by the lower interest rate. Even if they know it's coming, they might take the bait, but they don't know when it's going to end, right? It's hard to stop when the going's good, so to speak, right? Okay, so let's look at when we have multiple rounds of credit expansion. So we're going to start off at phase 2, right? So let's say the public is, they spend according to their old proportions. Does that mean the boom's over? Well, not necessarily. Most booms continue because the central bank keeps pumping in money. So it just adds another burst of credit expansion, okay? So in our diagram, we've got an increase in, say, the higher orders, again, more spending because the central bank keeps interest rates from rising. They pump in more credit. And the next phase 3 is basically the resources get brought back to the higher orders, or they don't even leave. All right, so that the booms continue because the central bank keeps pumping in the same amount of credit, right? Or it keeps pumping in credit, right? The issue is that, well, another round of credit ain't gonna do the trick because time preferences haven't changed, right? The public is going to spend, once again, according to their original proportions, and that means the central bank is going to be forced to keep expanding the money supply, so keep pumping in more and more credit, and that means prices will keep rising. So we can see kind of this tug of war, and the structure of production lengthens, then it's trying to be shortened, but then the central bank pumps in more money, then it's trying to be shortened, so the central bank keeps pumping in more money, and so on. Okay. All right, so this is unsustainable. All right, why is this unsustainable? Well, I'm running out of room, okay? And I'm also running out of colors. I can't keep doing this. I don't know what else I'm gonna do. It's gonna hit, if I do this another time, it's gonna hit expansion, it's gonna look ugly, it's gonna be this whole thing. So it's unsustainable. All right, in reality, I have phase 4 here. In reality, it's unsustainable for different reasons, okay? So why is it unsustainable? Well, because if the central bank keeps doing this, they're going to find that they're going to actually have to start increasing the money supply at an accelerating rate. Let's say they were increasing the money supply each year by 5%, and that was leading to, say, 3% inflation, or inflation understood as price inflation or a rise in prices, okay? They're actually gonna have to start increasing the money supply by, say, 7% or 8% or 10%, and then prices are gonna rise by, they're gonna go from 3% to 5% to 7% and so on. So more and more credit will have to be pumped in at an accelerated rate. And why will this occur? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, because time preferences will actually begin to rise. All right, the public will no longer be spending according to their old unchanged proportions, but now the proportion of consumption spending to investment spending will go up. And why will this happen? So Mises discussed the phenomenon of capital consumption, basically referring to the fact that when inflation occurs, when prices rise, the traditional methods of accounting aren't always the best at actually actually sort of showing whether or not entrepreneurs are earning profits or losses. So when prices rise, entrepreneurs are going to be tricked by their accounting because they're not going to record the prices of their factors of production at their new prices. They're going to have recorded them at their old prices. So they're going to save a certain amount that they think is going to be enough, but it's actually not going to be enough. And this reminds me a lot of during the housing boom, and even during COVID, when initially prices were going up and people thought they were making a bunch of money. Businesses thought they were making a bunch of money. You see the price of your home going up. You see maybe the price of your stock portfolio going up and so on. But then you start to realize that your costs of production have actually gone up. And you realize that too late, because originally when you're making profits, you're spending some of it on consumption. And you're spending more of it on consumption than you realize. You're engaging in capital consumption, right? And then you kind of get the hangover, because you realize, oh, wait a second, my cost of production are rising more than what I had anticipated. I've actually been consuming my capital, so to speak. All right, so you have this issue that sort of inevitably tends to develop in the course of a business cycle if it continues long enough. All right, you also get something else that happens, and this is the phenomenon of inflationary expectations. So when people start to expect prices are going up each year, they're going to start to anticipate it. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And what that means is people are going to be decreasing their demand for money, and they are going to be basically they're going to be willing to pay higher prices now because they expect prices to rise even by an even greater amount in the future. And what this means is that in order to basically keep the interest rate from rising, the central bank will have to pump in even more money. Right? So both of these, I'm not going to draw the diagrams, but both of these issues mean that as time goes on, when the public spends according to their old proportions, they're actually, the time preferences are rising, and the central bank's going to have to add in even more money. All right, and this is really where the unsustainable nature of the boom starts to take hold, because if prices rise by greater amounts each year, this is a problem. Because the end result ultimately is hyperinflation and a collapse in the economy. So hyperinflation is just when prices start rising without limit. The bare definition of hyperinflation is, I believe it's a 50% rise in prices each month, right? So that's a lot, but it can get a lot higher than that. And as that happens, money loses its store of value function, its ability to serve as a unit of account, and so on. So really, the economy starts to collapse. Now, this is the ultimate limit to the boom. Right, this rarely happens. This has never happened in the United States. You could say the closest this happened, we came to this in peacetime, was at least in the 1970s, when you had inflation over 10%, right? So instead, most central banks, they're going to decide to stop the boom by ending their credit expansion. They're going to get worried about rising prices, whether from the public being upset or politicians being upset, saying, hey, you got to stop prices from rising. This is becoming too big of an issue. So the central bank will stop credit expansion. It might even engage in credit contraction, right? And we were nowhere close to hyperinflation a couple of years ago, but the Federal Reserve did drastically stop its monetary expansion in 2022, beginning then, because prices were getting unacceptably high from the public's perspective. Okay, so this is sort of the ultimate limit. Right? So why booms continue is because the central bank keeps pumping in money. Right? And ultimately why booms end, whether it's a one-shot injection of credit or multiple rounds of credit expansion, is because eventually the central bank is going to be incentivized or pressured to stop expanding credit. Right? So something I want to talk about, which is very important because I think it's relevant to today's economy, because you might ask yourself, okay, well, they said the central bank, the Federal Reserve, it lowered interest rates in 2020, 2021, then it raised interest rates in 2022, 2023, and here we are. The economy is sort of softening. We're not quite yet to 2% inflation, but unemployment's rising. So how do business cycles actually look in the real world? Or why don't we immediately get, say, the bust? This is a very important point that Mises discusses, and it's that the business cycle may be superimposed upon economic growth. All right, what do I mean by that? Well, this entire theory that I've just sketched out is invoking ceteris paribus, right? All else equal. We're holding everything else constant. Now, of course, in the real world, not everything else is held equal. Not all else is held equal, right? Other things are happening. Other factors that could be causing economic growth, right? So the business cycle can occur alongside economic growth, say an increasing supply of labor, technological innovation, improvement in market rules, lower time preferences, and so on. So at least in the economy we are currently in, the economy has been buttressed, you could say. It's been kept afloat. One, there's an increasing supply of labor. A lot of workers re-entered the labor market after COVID, and you've seen a lot of immigration that has basically facilitated greater production. And of course, there's technological innovation. Since the late 2022, there's been a lot of emphasis on artificial intelligence, AI, and all of that stuff, and how that will change the economy's long-run growth potential, and so on and so forth. We haven't really seen an improvement in market rules or a movement to the free market. I think this was more applicable in the 1980s and the 1990s, especially with the collapse of communism just around the world. You could say that the world moved to, not to the free market, but at least away from hardcore intervention, right? So these factors can always be occurring, and they always are occurring. But what matters, as Mises says, and this quote is on page 562 of Human Action, is that the business cycle makes us poor relative to if the credit expansion had not occurred. All these factors could still be occurring. It could be leading to increased production and economic growth and all this stuff, but it's not going to lead to as much production and as much economic growth if we didn't have the credit expansion. Because the credit expansion is wasting resources. It's causing malinvestments. It could be leading to capital consumption and other types of distortions, okay? So it's important to remember this, that when a bust occurs in the real world, we still might be richer than, than compared to before the boom, right? But as Mises says, that's just because there's other factors that are happening at the same time. Right? Again, not all else is held equal, right? So we return to our three questions. Right? What are our three questions? What causes the boom? Right? Remember, we asked that question. We say, what brings about the boom? And the answer to that question is a central bank's credit expansion. Right? It's the central bank pumping in more money in the economy, artificially lowering interest rates, pushing the loan rate below the originary rate of interest. That's what causes the boom, because that's what causes entrepreneurs to take the bait, and they are going to expand the structure of production. All right. Why does the boom continue? All right. Well, the boom continues because, as we've discussed, the central bank keeps expanding credit. It's not just a one-shot injection of credit in the real world, at least in most cases. Now, again, it could be a boom of a couple years. It could be a boom of 5 years, even say 10 years. But the central bank is still expanding credit. It's still pumping in money into the economy, right? And then what causes the bust? Well, it's the central bank stops expanding credit. And there could be a lag, so to speak, as it's known in macroeconomics as long and variable lags. So when the central bank slows down the growth rate of the money supply, it could take a couple years before entrepreneurs really realize that some of the projects they've invested in are actually not as profitable as they thought. Because it takes time for it to affect the economy, and again, there are other factors. Economic growth could be occurring along the same time, and that could be sort of prolonging the period of expansion and so on. But we know that when the central bank stops expanding credit, you will have some sort of bust, at least relative to what would have occurred if the central bank had not engaged in credit expansion at the beginning. So we can see from this that Mises' business cycle theory, the Mises-Hayek theory of the trade cycle, as it's known, is integrated. It is a completely integrated whole. The boom is linked to the bust. Most macroeconomic theories, they don't talk about the boom, as I mentioned. Everything's just great, and then you've got the bust, and that's when there are issues, right? So, in conclusion, just to summarize, capital-based macroeconomics explains several things, right? One explains sustainable growth. All right, we know that sustainable growth is the result of lower time preferences. So one of the reasons why living standards have risen, as opposed, from your grandparents' generation to your parents' generation, now to the current generation, is because the public has saved more. Their proportion of consumption to investment spending has declined relatively, and we've seen the structure of production get longer and be able to produce more and more capital goods that lead to more and more consumer goods being produced. We know that unsustainable growth is the result of credit expansion, right? That artificially lowers interest rates, that causes an unsustainable boom, that is unsustainable because the public's time preferences have not changed. And we know that this boom inevitably leads to a bust or some sort of slowdown in production, all else equal, right? So I think I'm out of time. I will end there. Thank you so much.